Hello, gremlins! I've gotten back into knitting in the last few months, and made my largest project ever, recently as of the time of filming this intro, a moss blanket, which I have already shown off on the channel. And knitting this moss blanket, made of a variety of different small patches of knitted squares, makes me want to do more. And so my idea is to now knit a moss sweater in much the same style. This time, though, it will have a lining, which I've acquired, and I will cut this lining out into the shape of the sweater and then use that as a template for all my moss patches. And I've been collecting yarn of various shades of green to be able to start this project. So today, I'm going to get the template sorted and begin the process of collecting patches, which I'll work on over the next few weeks and or months until I have enough to sew a sweater. Enjoy! The lining I bought is brown fleece, which will both look like dirt or wood through the holes of the moss on top, and will be very warm and cozy through the winter. I didn't end up using the template I cut out here due to making the arms too narrow, but I didn't film a cutting of the second attempt, so I'm using the footage anyway. I'm using the hoodie that I like the fit of as a pattern, and just tracing around the arms and body, flipping it along the shoulder line and tracing again before cutting the fabric out. And because this is fleece, I don't have to worry about fraying or hemming or anything like that, which is great. I also cut a front slip and a neck hole. This sweater isn't designed to close, since I so rarely bother to button or zip up over layers that do have closures. I then draped the pattern over myself to test the fit, which is where I realized that I should have made the arms wider and decided to cut out a second attempt off camera. Off camera, I also washed the pattern piece so that in the future the fabric won't shrink, not that I'll be machine washing the finished sweater. I'm going to do most of the knitting for this project off camera, as part of the purpose of the project is to give me something to do with my hands in class, while watching TV, in my therapist's office, or any other place where I need my brain focused on something else. However, I did decide to knit the first patch on camera. This patch is knitted with two-stranded knitting, one lighter green than the other to make a mottled effect. All my patches are designed to be a little larger than my palm, although their sizes will vary, and once I get close to finishing, many patches will be sized to fit in specific gaps. I used to hate knitting. My mum tried so hard to get me to like it, as it is a hobby she enjoyed, but I found it boring and I never finished a project. Until I mentioned offhandedly to the bearded gremlin that I could probably knit using pencils, he told me there was no way, and I picked up the hobby out of spite. And apparently the trick to get me to like knitting is for the product to be moss, because knitting is just the perfect texture to make moss. Not only have I knitted the moss blanket, I've also made moss patches for a floor cushion, for my desk chair, and for a stuffed bear. I did a lot of knitting in the first week of this project, I just couldn't stop. And only 4 or 5 days in, I felt like I'd knitted over half my sweater. I hadn't, I'm bad at estimating, but I was excited to show off my progress. And sorry about my audio in the next clip. My mic was on, but I was using the wrong camera app, so my camera didn't use the mic's audio, but the phone's. It hasn't even been a week. I thought that this project would take weeks, maybe a month, but it hasn't even been a week, and I've made 40 of these. I am on fire. I don't think I have nearly enough to actually make the sweater yet, but I do have enough, I think, to start laying the patches out on my template and figuring out what spaces need to be filled and how the patches might be arranged. So let's go do that, and then I'll keep knitting more, because I can't be stopped right now. I'm making sure that the patches at the cuffs and collar are yarns that are soft and good textures to me, but the rest of the patches are just placed wherever they will fit, and the placement will change many times before this sweater is done. I also have a lot less patches than I thought, or rather a lot more surface area to cover than I thought, so I have a few more weeks of work ahead of me. But even with less than half the sweater covered, I'm getting so excited about how it will look in the end. I have 4 categories of green in my collection: bright green, dark green, yellow green, and olive greens, and I'm trying to space the patches out so that there is a fairly even distribution of each shade across the sweater. Another patch knitted on camera, this one also two-stranded. I had a variety of yarns I used for this project, some large balls of yarn I bought new, some lovely soft greens I found in a pack at a thrift store, and some yarns that were once blue or yellow but the house cat dyed green for me. Fun fact, pure wool can be dyed with food colouring, as can other protein fibres. One just needs to soak it in vinegar, then place it in the oven with a food colouring and water bath until all the dye is absorbed into the fibres. And it makes the yarn look mottled and mossy, it's great. Thanks, house cat! I also used a lot of tapestry yarn for this project. 1 skein is about as much as I need for 1 patch, and the nearest craft store to me doesn't have a wide range of mossy yarns, but it does have many shades of green tapestry wool, so I frequented it weekly to restock my supplies. I would have made my wool stocks go further had I not done so many two-stranded patches, but I loved the look of using 2 yarns at once so much, so I couldn't stop. And in the end, with many trips to craft stores and a few frantic op-shop hunts, I had enough to finish my sweater. While I hunted for the yarn, I had a hair tie I wore around my wrist with a scrap of each colour tied to it for colour matching. Later in the project I knew what shades to get without the reference, but early on it was very helpful to avoid greens that were too bright or too cool-toned. My last knitting project, the blanket, had me buy several greens that I couldn't use for it because they were too bright compared to the rest, although I did find a use for them making a pair of very bright mismatched leg warmers, pictured here. Now, clearly, I'm not done, given all the blank space still on my template. However, I do know where some of the patches are going to be in the final, specifically the patches around the cuff and the neckline, because I've chosen those to be in this particular location based on the texture of the yarn, since these will be the patches that are connecting to my skin. So while the rest of the patches are still being shuffled and reshuffled as I add more, those patches can be sewn down now to really solidify them in place. So that's what I'm going to do now before I continue making more patches. First, I moved the patches adjacent to the ones I'm sewing out of the way. I tried using yarn to sew, like I did to attach the patches together on my moss blanket. However, the yarn was too thick to go through the fleece, so I switched to thread, which is probably better, more sturdy and less visible anyway. I'm starting with the patches around the collar. There are 5, all chosen for their softness. None of the yarn I'm using is actively a bad texture for me, I wouldn't be able to knit with it if it was. However, some are definitely scratchier than others, and I want those away from my skin. Sewing these patches down took a lot longer than I expected. I'm using simple whip stitches, but keeping my stitches pretty close together so the patches are secure. I'm also stretching my patches in places to keep some edges straight and others curved to follow the line of the collar. This is a benefit to knit that I make use of often in this project to fill gaps or non-perpendicular edges. You've probably guessed from my whole vibe and also the other things I've mossed on the channel, but I love moss. When I see it in the wild, I would just go touch it, and I love putting fake moss, whether it be store-bought, knit, embroidered, or textured fabric, on everything I can. And I will continue to overgrow things with moss for the foreseeable future. It has such a nice look and texture. As someone who grew up a dinosaur kid, moss evolved from one of the earliest plants, splitting off before plants evolved vascular systems, making them ancient and really cool. I also love ferns, which do have vascular systems but evolved before flowers did, so maybe I just have a thing for paleo plants. Point is, adding more moss to my wardrobe is something that makes me very excited. And even before I finished this project, I had at least 2 more ideas that involve mossy clothes, so stay tuned if you too have an affinity for this organism. I also love things that are patchy, either completely patchwork or have patches sewn onto a base, so really this project is the best of both worlds. With the 5 patches of the collar sewn in place, I moved my camera so I could work on the sleeves, which are only 3 patches each and should be a little quicker to sew. When I reached a seam between 2 patches that are both being sewn down at the moment, I sewed the seam on both at once, rather than going all the way around one patch and then all the way around the next, if that makes sense. When I'm sewing the rest down, I'll do the same thing on all sides, but for now I'm keeping the patches not directly against the cuffs and collar, loose and free to be moved around as I keep working, rather than with one side sewn down to their adjacent patch. While I continue to work, what further moss-related projects, or just projects in general, would you like to see? I have a whole bunch of projects being planned right now, and I'm making the most of my school break to do as many as possible, but presumably at some point I'll run out and need some new ideas, and it's always a good idea to ask you guys if there's anything you want to see me make, mossy or otherwise. Safety pins have been my friend during this project. Anytime a section of patch needs to be stretched out, for example to follow the slightly diagonal line of the sleeve template, I'm able to pin all the corners down to keep it stretched where I want it while I sew. And safety pins will continue to be the MVPs of this project the deeper in I get. My back is not being an MVP, however. I know I'm sitting with truly terrible posture while I work, but I wish it didn't have consequences. I want to be able to creature all over the floor without any back pain. How dare the world be so cruel to me? Anyway, ignoring my back pain, I finished the last patch on this arm and moved to an even more uncomfortable position to sew the other. I've been trying to keep this project out of the way, well, as out of the way as any setup project with 1.5 meters of surface area can be in a tiny apartment bedroom, which means that the second sleeve is right next to my desk. And I can't move it without moving all the unsecured patches, so I just have to make the best of the situation, crouched down right by my desk drawers and partially sitting on my project to sew. If you were wondering about the random balls of yarn laid out on the blank spaces of the sweater while I work, I'm constantly thinking ahead in this project, and while I knit one patch, I lay out the placement of 4 to 6 more, where I think they should go and what colours would go in the area. This rarely stays the same as I keep working, but it keeps me, most of the time, from trying to knit 4 patches at once with only 2 pairs of needles, and ending up with a massive tangle. And with several more weeks of knitting off camera whenever I got the chance, including watching Project Hail Mary twice, and trying to knit with very blurry vision while I cried both times, I'm knitting my last patch. Sort of. I'll explain that later. It's single-stranded and from a ball of light green muted yarn that is one of the only balls of yarn I have left at this point. It's also one of the softer yarns I have, very nice to work with, and sadly, sold by a store that is closing in a few months, so I should stock up. As I'm working, I'm constantly checking the size of my patch, as this one is knitted to fill a very specific gap, and when it fits, I cast off my last patch for now, and it's time to sew. Finally, the patches are all knitted. The next step is sewing the patches to the sweater, but most of that I'm going to do off camera because I simply do not have the storage space on my phone to film the whole thing, given how long it took to just sew the collar and cuff patches when I did that earlier in the project. I'll sew the first patch on camera, and then I'll take periodic photos throughout the process, if I can remember to show the sweater as it comes together. and I'll check in with you when the patches are almost done. I'm starting the sewing with the front of the sweater, where it will be easier to maneuver the fabric due to the slit down the middle. The first patch, other than the ones I sewed already, is this mottled, bright green one of the yarns that the house cat dyed with food colouring, and one that I particularly liked working with. And again, as I'm going, I'm sewing down the bordering edges of other patches, so even just with this one patch, several are now attached in place. I'm doing my best to make sure all the ends of the knitting, which one would normally weave in, are between the patch and the lining so I don't have to do that. Here's the first section of the front done. And enjoy some music while I show the rest of my process photos. I decided to sew the final patch on camera, or rather, the final few patches as they're all attached together. The back of the sweater is a little more wonky than the front, with some tiny patches and some long ones to fill space left over, but it all works towards the mossy vibe I want out of the sweater. I also had to knit a couple extra patches during the sewing process as gaps opened up where I'd spaced sections incorrectly. Lots of rearranging was involved, but I'm happy with the final composition. Or rather, not quite final, as there are a few more things I want to add to this sweater once I pick it up and try it on. Before we get to that though, the end was in sight as I finished these last patches, and I was racing for the finish line. I think I thought I had less patches left than I did, so it took a little longer to reach the end than I expected, but I still got there, a couple lengths of thread and about 20 minutes later. And once again, to reveal it, I used the wrong camera, so the audio is from my phone, not the microphone pinned to my shirt. Urgh. The base of the sweater is now done, and the next step is going to be sewing just the sleeves together, and then probably attaching more patches to the bottom, because I don't think it's quite long enough. On my base template wasn't quite long enough, but I want to sew the sleeves on first so I can actually wear it and see how much longer I need to make it. And if I do decide to make it longer, it's going to involve a trip to the craft store. So while the sleeves aren't exactly sewn yet, I can kind of drape this on myself. And probably bump my mic a bunch. A test case. Oh, obviously not quite right, but I think just one more layer of patches. Hold on. I need to adjust my camera down a bit. I think one more row of patches at the bottom will make it long enough, but I'm going to first sew the sleeves into tubes and then go from there. I'm so excited about this. Sew the sleeves into tubes I did, first positioning the sleeve right side to right side so that it's inside out, and then using safety pins, once again an MVP, to pin it together while I used whip stitches to sew through both the knitted layer and the fleece layer. Everything sewn in this project has to be hand sewn. I can't use my machine because of the thickness of the seams and the fear that my machine would eat the knit. So each bit of sewing takes a while, a good chance to chill and listen to some music for you watching, and a chance for me to continue a rewatch of Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. With the sleeves done, I tried the sweater on and confirmed that it was both very cozy, I wore it around the house for the rest of the day, and needed another row of patches like I'd suspected. So to the craft store I went and laid out my nice selections of yarn for 9 more patches. I photographed a few of them as I went, then kind of forgot to photograph the rest, so we returned to me sewing, this time while finally getting around to watching Wicked. I had earlier pinned the side seams of the sweater together with safety pins, as well as pinned all the new patches in place to check the fit and length, so now all I need to do is sew everything together. I'm starting with the side seams, using thread like I used everywhere else, and sewing through both the fleece and the patches to make sure everything is securely attached. If you were to attempt a project like this, knitted patches on a fabric base, I'd recommend a couple things. First of all, make sure the base is actually the size you need. I'd recommend making it a little larger than you think you need because the knit will add bulk and you still need to move your arms if this is a sweater. The reason my base is too short is because I measured the sleeves wrong on my first attempt and was trying to fit a second attempt into my fabric. Second, it will take more patches and more yarn than you think. I personally think that having a set colour scheme of yarn makes the end product look unified and less busy, but if you like a more chaotic style, use whatever mix of colours you want. I'd recommend using chunky needles. Mine are 7.5mm because I learned to knit on pencils and that's the type of knitting I like. Chunkier knit makes the end project more textured and also has each patch take less time. I definitely recommend a project like this if you like having something to do with your hands that doesn't require much brain power once you get the hang of it. This supplied about a month's worth of hands-busy projects for me. And it doesn't have to be a sweater. This could work for a blanket. Honestly, I'd recommend having a backing fabric for a blanket, as mine without it is a little fragile. It could work for a pillow cover, a vest, a cloak, a shawl, a capelet. If you do small patches, it could even work for a beanie, leg warmers, or fingerless gloves, although I might recommend using a thinner yarn and fabric. If you do decide to make something patchwork and knit, I'd love to see it. Tag me on Instagram at itsgreenthegremlin. When I had finished the side seams, I moved on to sewing the final patches in place, and I switched to sewing the patches together with yarn. These patches aren't sewn to the fleece, as the fleece stops short. Instead, they are just sewn to the patches above them, and sewing knit to knit without a backing fabric works better with thread the same weight as the knit. I alternated between 2 shades of green depending on the colour of the patches, and for some patches my unwoven ends were long enough to sew aside together. That's the other thing. As I went along, I also wove in all the ends that didn't get hidden by my fleece, as well as the ends of my sewing yarn, which I tied off, leaving a tail behind. I made the mistake of trimming those tails on my moss blanket, and the patches keep coming apart because of it. Don't make my mistake and weave in those ends as well. This final section of sewing took long enough that my phone stopped recording toward the end. Apparently, even with plenty of storage, my phone decides that it's been long enough after about an hour and a quarter. Luckily, I was mostly done at that stage. For now, I'll let you watch the rest of the sewing with some lovely music before we head to the reveal. The sweater is finished, and I am so happy with it. It is also the perfect season for it, as I'm in the southern hemisphere and it is cold at the moment. This is so cozy and warm. I'm loving wearing it. I've also been inspired while I was working on this sweater by other people's takes on moss sweaters, and so I will probably be making a second moss sweater of a different style soon. I'm on school break at the moment, which means I'm planning on filming as many videos as possible to build up a buffer to release over the next few months. And one of those will be another moss sweater, because I can't have too much moss in my wardrobe. But yeah, I had so much fun with this. It was such a good craft to just bring with me places. Knitting small patches is such a good thing for me to keep my hands busy and my mind focused. And I will be looking for more excuses to knit more things in the future. So thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Until then, bye!